Thank you very much for that welcome and for your invitation to be here. And it's really, I was saying to Bishop Philip on the way up that because I have to sort of do a lot of stuff with the arts in my job, to be called, and sometimes that can feel like it's pulling me away from substantial doctrinal issues. It's really nice to be asked to think and talk about a big doctrine. But I will bring some art in. But for me, it's been really refreshing to think again, to sort of take the temperature, if you like, of the doctrine and think about some of the varieties of ways that currently, certainly contemporary British theology might be positioning itself around the doctrine of the Atonement. And I think that in some ways reflects fairly accurately the range of views that is there out in the church as well. You can tell me if you disagree with that. There is an important distinction to make right at the outset, and that's between the mechanism of atonement and the result of atonement. And that's something I just want us to keep in mind in the next hour or so, the mechanism of atonement and the result of atonement. The latter, the result of atonement, is what we typically call salvation. Of course, actually, etymologically, the word atonement contains, as it were, is both mechanism and result, because it breaks down into at-one-ment, as lots of you know. So it's about something, it's about the reconnection, the reconciliation, the reunifying of something broken or divided. But very often, salvation is the word we'll most readily turn to when we're trying to think about what the result of atonement is. And there are many, many different pictures of what salvation looks like, jostling alongside one another, both in the Bible and also throughout Christian tradition. All those many images that different thinkers and writers have reached and pulled in to give different perspectives on whatever it is that salvation might mean. And I'm going to look at some of those particular accounts of what salvation might mean in a minute. But we might say that what unites them is the idea that fellowship with God, or restored fellowship with God, perhaps better, is what we are saved for. We are saved we're saved back into fellowship with God. Salvation, in a sense, is a word to describe that renewed, restored fellowship with God. And our experience of salvation, if we feel it is an experience, and that's something that people have different views about too, whether it's something we actually feel or something that simply happens somewhere in the mind of God, whether or not we have any sense of it. And some doctrines of election can actually leave us feeling that it might not be, we might not know whether or not we've been saved, which causes quite a lot of angst, because you can spend a lot of time examining yourself for signs of whether or not you're regenerate or being made new. Or perhaps you don't think there are any actual experience signs of salvation. But if you do think there is some kind of experience involved in salvation, then it's experienced as, in some way, I think, a coming into fellowship where it didn't exist before. And it might be that we know that new fellowship with God because we experience it as fellowship with God's creatures, and particularly perhaps with one another in the body of the church. But this sense of what we might be saved for, fellowship or something like that, implies also a sense of what we're being saved from. So every doctrine of the atonement and every model of salvation that might be part of that doctrine of the atonement implies in some way, has implicit within it at least one idea of what it is we're being saved from. The word salvation doesn't really mean anything if we don't think there's something to be saved from. So how is it that we might, what do we imagine that it is that we're being saved from? And how might it be in continuity with or differ from some of the things that our forebears in the communion of saints in the great history of Christianity have thought they were being saved from? Paul Tillich, the 20th century German theologian, although he spent a lot of his later career in the United States, described what he saw as three significant stages. Some of you will have read his account of this, three significant stages in the doctrine of salvation, and he identified those three stages by the three different things he thought people predominantly thought in different eras of history they were being saved from. And the first of those was death. So for him, on his account, much of the early church in the first centuries of the church was most concerned about mortality and the finitude of human life, the fact that our lives would come to an end, and that might just be it. It was bound up too with ideas of the power of the devil over us, and so where there were accounts of the afterlife, death was also a place of ongoing punishment. But the fundamental category of death and the devil, in brackets after it, was what most dominated people's concerns when they thought about what it was that Christ had achieved. Which is why when the Christian art of the atonement began to come into being, because there was really almost none for the first 4 centuries, but when the church went public, became the imperial religion, there was an opportunity to begin to decorate purpose-built church buildings for the first time. And as the art of the early church developed, almost all of those early images of what salvation might look like had to do with victory over death, and therefore with a very, very strong emphasis on life. So despite what your bishop has just said about the grisliness of the doctrine, actually in the art of the early church, the art of the atonement was extremely celebratory. The cross was a glorious thing, often depicted as a tree coming into bloom, full of living things that were nesting in its branches, often depicted gloriously, so literally golden in mosaics and other forms of decoration. And this was all part of that sense that life had vanquished death. So what atonement achieved was that sense that death had lost its sting. Death had no more power over us. We might have to undergo physical death, but that was only a step on the way to the full and glorious eternal life promised to us by Christ, who had conquered the devil, opened hell, and opened a way for us too into sharing that life with him in heaven. So Tillich's first category was death as the thing we're saved from. As the medieval period developed, and these are of course big generalizations, but as the medieval period developed, there was an increasing sense of both the suffering of Christ, the cost of how that winning that victory had, as it were, played out in Christ's own life and body, and a sense of our concomitant responsibility for that suffering that we'd put Christ through. So something called the Devotio Moderna in the medieval period, the modern devotion, began increasingly to centre on the sufferings of Christ, and much visual art of the atonement in this period has a sense of direct and very emotive challenge to the viewer, as if to say, what have I done, to quote the Lamentations, what have I done to you that you should have done this to me? To elicit from you both compassion, a sense of suffering with, feeling with Christ in his sufferings, but also a sense of guilt and responsibility. And therefore, it was hoped, an increased impetus towards reformation of life, transformation, a new way of being, because the consequences of sin were so manifestly dreadful to contemplate. So we are into the grisly territory in this period. And there are, despite the great rupture that the Reformation represents, there are actually really powerful continuities as well between that medieval form of devotion and that medieval way of envisioning and thinking about the cross, and a lot of Reformed ways, especially Lutheran ways of thinking about the meaning of the cross. And it's sin that becomes the key thing we're saved from, perhaps more, at least according to Tillich's account, perhaps more than death in this period. It's sin that's the great thing that has to be overcome, that Christ overcomes for us. And it's the confrontation with the nature of our sin and the extensiveness of our sin that, as you'll know from, if you know anything about Luther's own biography, that's so paralyzing for him in the period directly before his great moment of conversion, in which he realizes that the full acceptance of his utter sinfulness is precisely the necessary realization before you come to that sense of the absolute gratuity and freedom of God's grace, that you can do nothing to earn God's grace. The cross, therefore, is something done wholly in order for you, as it were, in your place, rather than something you have to participate in through doing your little bit through extra works. Works become wholly a matter of response to what is already accomplished, already achieved in the cross. But the art of Lutheran Protestantism, which is a very rich tradition, not all Protestant traditions eradicated the visual arts. Lutheran churches particularly sustained a very rich and wonderful visual culture, is still very much focused on the suffering of Christ on the cross, on the cost of our sin. So death in the early church, sin in the medieval, and then especially in the Reformation period. And then Tillich turns to our own era, the modern era. Does anyone remember or know or want to guess what the thing is that he thinks we moderns most need to be saved from? Ourselves. That's a really interesting suggestion. It isn't actually what he thinks, but I like it. And I guess the sin one, in a way, could also be put as to do with ourselves. Can see some mouths moving, but I can't quite hear the voices. Yes, meaninglessness. Yeah. So Tillich thinks that the great modern condition is a sense that nothing really adds up to anything. With the arbitrary random products of, let's say, evolution, the movement of various bits of matter around the universe, there's no real significance to our individual lives. These are the products of a much, much larger historical sense and a new relativism that comes with the modern awareness that, the world was here, however many billions of years before we were. Something will be here billions of years afterwards. The span of life of the human race looks tiny compared with that, and of our individual lives even smaller. So there's no real sense that we amount to anything very much. And the world itself, we have far more, as it were, relativism in the way we view the significance of our social, political arrangements. They too seem like sort of always only temporary little constructions in the middle of the great ocean of time. So you've got a very sense of the fragility and arbitrariness of life. And what Tillich proposes, is that what we need to be saved from, is that sense that it's all meaningless. This is the great modern issue. How Christ does that, or whether he persuasively argues that Christ does that, is another matter. I'm not quite sure he does, but I think he's on to something about an aspect of the modern condition. And it may be that it's become even more acute since Tillich was writing, as we live in an era where so much does seem simply relative. So Christ at least offers the assurance that there is a point to life, that we are of some value, that we're to value others, because they too are regarded by God as of absolute value. And the things that we seek to do to imitate, follow Christ are worth doing. So in some ways this feeds into a form of a model of the atonement that's more often called a moral model of the atonement, something that's more to do with how we follow, the quality of our response, the quality of our imitation or discipleship of Christ. And it doesn't quite have that sense of the sheer helplessness, if you like, of the Lutheran model where you throw yourself utterly on grace. There's more of a sense that we do have something to join in with and participate in as we try and live lives with meaningful patterns and help to impart that kind of meaning to other people's lives as well. Well, those are three, and maybe a bit later on when we have some time for discussion, I'll ask whether you would want to add any to those three: death, sin, and meaninglessness. But already that gives us a sense of the variety, both across time as well as at any one particular moment of time, of emphases within doctrines of the atonement and models of salvation. Also, and this is again in the Bible alone, let alone later on in theological tradition, we see the biblical writers constructing accounts of the mechanism of atonement from all of the sources most readily available. And if you look at them all in aggregate together, you'll see that nearly every significant area of human life is drawn on, helpfully drawn on, to help give a sense of what atonement might be or how it might work. These include cultic models, so something to do with what goes on in the Jewish cultic tradition when the temple still existed and sacrifice still went on. So cultic models, legal models, So the first, on the cultic side, sacrifice obviously is the key word. This is a sacrifice, like, in some ways, like the sacrifice made by the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement in the Holy of Holies in the temple. Legal models, so the idea that there's some kind of verdict delivered, and that our justification, one of the most knotty and difficult words in the whole of the New Testament. I'm glad N.T. Wright isn't here, because he is the kind of righteousness man. But the idea that some sort of transaction of something like a legal type happens in order that we are spared the judgment that ought to be delivered to us. Closely connected with that, economic models of atonement, mainly to do with ransom, so that and therefore connecting with ideas of slavery, so that we are bought, our freedom is bought for us. That too has something, as I say, something in common with the more legal models, because it's about, as it were, a payment made on our behalf. Those are both quite substitutionary models. Military models, in other words, the idea that Christ wins a victory, the so-called Christus Victor model of the atonement. So that Christ, and it goes back to those very early emphases on sin, death, and the devil, that Christ overcomes, as it were, in battle, overcomes that which has entrapped us. And familial models, so adoption, for example, the idea that our salvation is an adoption by God, that we are adopted as children of God. We become like the siblings of Christ through adoption. And there are other relational models as well, but the familial is perhaps one of the strongest. And medical, and by that I mean the idea that that atonement is a kind of healing. And this is one that's especially strong in the teaching of St. Augustine of Hippo, who writes at length on, and increasingly at length, on the idea that our salvation is like an event of healing, partly because of his battles with the Pelagians. The Pelagians who, as you'll remember, who still held on to the idea that at least in principle, even if never actually in any one case, but in principle, we still retain the capacity to be righteous through our effort. Okay, so Pelagianism is the heresy that in some way our will is not completely affected by the fall. We can still, through an effort of will, in principle, we can still work our own salvation. And Augustine increasingly absolutely dismisses this idea. And he turns, in part, I think, in his writings against the Pelagians, he turns to the medical model because there's something about that, and one of his favorite examples of that degree of need for healing is the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which all of us, are the man by the side of the road who's half dead, who's been so badly wounded and beaten up, that we cannot help ourselves. We have to have help from another. And the Good Samaritan, of course, is the figure of Christ in his allegorical reading of this parable. So the sense of that in order to understand our own sin and what we need to be saved from, we have to imagine ourselves in that kind of condition, the condition of the man on the road down to Jericho, left, who would die if not helped. Okay, unable to stand up. For Augustine, that's the only way we can understand our sin. And I have to say, I happen to really like this model, because I think sin is a form of helplessness, and many models of sin shy away just from how radically helpless sin makes us. We are like the man beaten up by the roadside. Christ is the physician. And that seems to me a more truthful picture of sin. It's something that perhaps some modern people find quite difficult as a model. Perhaps it's because it's too physical an image of what salvation is and of how atonement works. And in that sense, maybe there are things in common with people's difficulty with sacrifice language and imagery too, which some consider a dead metaphor now, really, in Western culture, because we don't have live in a sacrificial economy, it's argued. We don't go to church and make sacrifices in that traditional way. We don't even like using the language of sacrifice that often metaphorically. Notice the way that it's much more sparingly used, for example, around Remembrance Day and in terms of commemoration. The sacrifice language can appear to kind of override the sheer horror and brutality of war by imparting to it a kind of sense of a glorious thing, or something that God might want even. So the awkwardness we feel around the language of sacrifice has several different causes, but one of the effects of that is that we, I don't think, so comfortably turn to it in our modern era as an account of how atonement works. Now, I promised you some pictures, so let's have a pause. Is there any way of turning the lights down a bit, or is it just all or nothing? I don't know whether all the lights at the front. That was wonderful. This is one example of lots and lots that I could have shown you. It's a mosaic in the apse of a church called Saint-Germiny-des-Prés in northern France. And it's a very significant, it was built, the whole of this church was built, and I can't remember which king built it all, but to very deliberate specifications in order to make both architectural and decorative links with the temple, the Jewish temple as it was imagined in Jerusalem. And what we have, and of course churches, all churches with any kind of typical shape and structure in some way echo the structure of the temple in Jerusalem. That sense of progression towards a sanctuary space is something that's there, built into the transitions you make from nave to choir to sanctuary. This sense of progressive movement towards a place where salvation, atonement was achieved. Salvation was won, atonement was achieved. And this is brought out more dramatically here by the choice of imagery that we have in the mosaic apse. Because what we're seeing initially might look like the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, which sat in the Holy of Holies of the temple, which contained, amongst other things, the tablets of the law, above which, between the cherubim, God invisibly sat enthroned on the mercy seat. And that sense of the most concentrated place of divine presence, divine power, and the place where the sprinkled blood of animals once a year was pleaded in order to secure, at least for one more year, the freedom of the people from their sins. All of that was encoded in this visual language. So you can see the two smaller cherubim, either side of this ark-like object, what initially looks like the ark, just as the cherubim would have stood either side, built into the ark, in fact, their wingtips touching. And the two larger angels representing what were likely to have been two other statues of angelic beings inside the sanctuary. All of that makes initially perfect sense if you know about the Jewish temple, or even indeed if you know the letter to Hebrews, because it's all in the letter to Hebrews, all of these parallels. But then, and this is the wonderful thing about the image, then you notice at the front of the ark-like structure, what? What can you see? Some white cloths, just kind of coming out of whatever it is, the ark-like thing, and draping down the front of it. So you can see them here. And you suddenly realize this is the tomb. And the tomb of Christ has been reconstituted, and as I say, it's all there in Hebrews, but the tomb of Christ has been reconstituted as the Holy of Holies. And the cloths are absolutely saturated with significance in a way that perhaps we're inclined sometimes to skim over. Because although, yes, those cloths at one level are simply the first witnesses to the resurrection of Christ, because they bound his body and he leaves them behind, having come back to life, there's even more to it than that. The symbolism of linen cloths touching the skin of Christ evokes the fact that the Jewish high priest, when he went into the Holy of Holies once a year, wore linen on that one occasion, not the normal golden vestments, but simple linen garments, touching his skin, and having sprinkled the blood, he came out and left the garments. They were never worn again. So the work of, as it were, the ritual work of atonement undertaken by the high priest is very closely bound up with this idea of the linen cloths worn once only and then left. And the detailed instruction for this ritual is all there in Leviticus. Maybe, also significantly, the material that was the interior of the tabernacle when it was still a tent, before it was a temple, was linen. So there's a sense, too, that the divine presence in the Holy of Holies was one that was, as it were, clothed in linen, so that the high priest on that day was clothed in a way like God's very presence. So the Holy of Holies clothed God's presence in linen, the high priest's body clothed in linen, and Jesus, who is both God and man, is clothed in linen, both like the high priest and like the God to whom the high priest makes the sacrifice, makes the offering. Both priest and victim, both priest and the one to whom the sacrifice is made. So these cloths left behind are proclamations of the two natures of Christ, as well as of the work of salvation undertaken by him once for all in the new Holy of Holies, which is the tomb, as the true high priest. And all of that's there in this image. So that's a kind of fabulous early image of atonement as cultic still, basically, all bound up with the rituals of sacrifice that belonged to the temple. Later, we get much more evidently military-type images, and these are ones that are both popular in visual art. This is a 13th century English illuminated manuscript in the British Library, in a psalter, but there are lots and lots of versions of this, of course, but not only in the kind of static visual arts, but in drama too. So the Harrowing of Hell becomes one of the most popular parts of the mystery cycle, and frequently performed. So people have had a very vivid sense of how Christ wins a victory through something like an assault on a siege, like a siege of a defended city, breaking down the doors and releasing those within. So that sense too of military metaphor, of course, gaining an extra kind of purchase on people's imaginations at the time of the Crusades too, comes out very vividly in this kind of atonement image. But this is a very different kind of thing from the first more cultic image that we saw. And then I spoke about the Devotio Moderna, and this is quite a late example of a tradition, very, very powerful tradition of imagery in the medieval period, painted by Giovanni Bellini. This is in the National Gallery, some of you may know it, called The Blood of the Redeemer. And it's a kind of improvisatory riff on one of the most important single images of the medieval Western Church, which is called the Imago Pietatis. Now, we tend in English to call it the Man of Sorrows. It's hugely important because in many ways it's based on an image, a vision that St. Gregory was meant to have had when saying Mass in Rome, at a time when people were disputing whether the consecrated elements of bread and wine were actually transubstantiated, whether Christ was actually present in them. And there were doubters in the congregation, and as Gregory was standing at the altar celebrating Mass, the actual body of Christ appeared. So the Imago Pietatis is often thought to be principally an image of the vision that Gregory had of the real Christ appearing on the altar. And that's why often the Imago Pietatis is shown only from the waist up, because it's, as it were, Christ was sort of a bit like a bust kind of on the altar, but alive. So you get that sense of the immediacy of the presence of Christ in this image. But at the same time, you get a quite sort of unhistorical compression of the events of the Passion into this one moment. It's not a historical moment, because Christ is often awake or alive, upright, and yet already wounded, so that the wounds of the crucifixion are in his body, and he's still wearing the crown of thorns. So there's no sense that you can identify a moment at which this happened. It's as if the whole narrative sequence of the Passion has been concertinaed into this one image. There was another reason it was very popular, which is that you got a very, very large indulgence if you said a certain prayer in front of an image of the Imago Pietatis. So, and it didn't have to be the original one, which was in a church in Rome, or what was thought to be the original one. Any reproduction of it, including printed ones, counted. So the proliferation of this image had other reasons too, but Bellini takes it and does something very different and unusual with it. He gives us a full-length Christ, and he shows us who's squeezing the blood. It's why it's called the blood of the Redeemer, squeezing blood from the wound in his side into a chalice held by a waiting angel. And the cloud-like things around his feet are clouds, but they would have had the faces of cherubim in. The painting got damaged at a certain point in its history, and those are not visible anymore. But there's a very peculiar suggestion that this is not a normal earthly space that he's occupying. In fact, what is the space that he's occupying? It's got this checkered green and white marble floor and this stone balustrade or rail at the far end. And it seems as though one of the first and most natural associations to make then is that it's like a sanctuary space in a church. This is painted in Renaissance Italy. Renaissance churches tend to have floors like that in the sanctuary space. So he's in the sanctuary where the high priest goes. We're back to that kind of set of cultic associations. But we're not looking towards the altar. We're looking out from the sanctuary, as it were, over the rail into the wider world, which has the very surprising and unsettling, and as far as I know, I don't know any other examples of works of art that have done this, implication that we are where the altar is, which might mean various things, but one possibility is that we're being invited to adopt the perspective of God the Father, to whom Christ makes his offering on behalf of the world, which is behind him. And a painting that puts you, as it were, in the position of God is a very startling one, but very powerful, and also so much more theologically sensitive than trying to depict God the Father. You can't depict God the Father. Lots of artists have foolishly tried, and personally, I think that the damage to people's imaginations of what God the Father might be, or what God, the source, might look like, are untold. But to suggest the presence of God, the first person of the Trinity, without actually depicting the first person of the Trinity seems to me brilliant. And Bellini, I think, might have done that in this image. And it means we look on the world through the sacrifice of Christ. And as we look at that world, we see certain things going on in the painting. Most of all, very significant distinction between what's on the right and on the left as we view it, so behind Christ. On the right, we see ruined buildings, and can you see that the tree up on the hill on the right is all gnarled and leafless? Again, this is a very classic thing in Renaissance art. And there are two little figures who are probably a priest and an acolyte walking along a path from the right, as we look at it, towards the left. And on the left, we have a beautifully pristine set of buildings that look in perfect condition, perhaps new, and a much more lush and verdant and less hostile landscape. So we've got that sense of a transition happening with Christ's figure as the transition point. But even more significantly, the path that those two little figures are on, and you probably need to see it more closely to see this, but trust me, the path curls round, it sort of folds back on itself, and then it folds back again, and it leads right up to the entrance in that altar rail type thing. And then it goes on, having gone past that sanctuary space, and folds back round on itself, and then back loops around one more time as it leads to the new creation, or the new Jerusalem, or however you want to imagine that on the left. So the path from the old to the new, from the old order of sin and death to the new creation, is via the sacrifice of Christ, through these folds. And folds are something that Bellini loves and comes back to again and again. He did lots of versions of this type of image, the Man of Sorrows type, the Imago Pietatis type. But in both of these examples, he's really individualized them. He hasn't done them in any sort of a typical way. So here, the fact that Christ has this garment on is extremely unusual. Again, I don't know of any other examples. And that he's holding a book. We can only speculate about that. But what especially intrigues me about this image is not just the fact he's wearing a garment, but the rend in the garment, which reveals his breast, and it really does look quite breast-like. The art historian Paul Hills has written an article just on that, and he says the degree of shadowing and demarcation under the breast, it's the wound. I mean, it is the wound, but it's positioned in such a way as to give the impression that Christ's nipple is like a nurturing breast, and it's almost like a maternity gown that Christ is wearing. So we get the sense of not just a dense enfoldedness of meaning in Christ, but also an invitation, as it were, to participate in, to be folded into the body of Christ. And the word for fold, one word for fold in Latin that Bellini would have been very aware of, is the same as the word for breast. So we get the sense of this being a fold into which we are invited in some way, through the folds of the garment, into the folds of the body. And maybe that's another interesting invitation to think about atonement with some slightly different language and imagery. So those are a few bits of visual light relief, maybe. I've talked about how certain traditional models are perhaps more difficult for us moderns to relate to. I want to reflect on a couple of examples of how more modern thinkers, more recent thinkers, have tried to shift the emphasis in slightly different directions. And two in particular. We've already talked about Tillich. One is Karl Barth, the great Swiss Reformed theologian, and one of both the most magnificently sustained but also controversial achievements of Barth is to seem at least to make atonement something that principally happens in knowledge, to make it more of an epistemological event, to use the fancy word, something that happens in terms of what we know. And this is because the revelation-centered quality of Barth's doctrine is such an organizing power over all the other things that he says in all of those 6 million words of the church dogmatics. If the idea of revelation becomes almost synonymous with salvation, the revelation of truth becomes almost synonymous with salvation, and the atonement that's envisioned is really, if you like, the union of our minds with the mind of God, and that above all what God achieves in coming among us in Christ to live and die and rise again is to reveal truth, then atonement can sometimes seem like an event in knowledge. Now, I think there's much more to Barth than that. And the late John Webster was very, very doughty defender of the fact that Barth's doctrine of revelation was a subset of his doctrine of reconciliation. It was just, as it were, the knowledge bit of a larger doctrine of reconciliation. But nevertheless, it's quite easy to read Barth and feel like mainly what he's concerned with is the knowledge that revelation brings to us and how that saves us. So it's a mixed success, and I would suggest, but an interesting one that's quite revealing of a certain set of modern priorities. We're very obsessed with how we can know anything to be true. And the other example I would invite you to reflect on is David Ford, now emeritus professor, Regius Professor from Cambridge. Lots of you will know his work. And David's fascinating attempt is to try and think about in his book Self and Salvation, is to try and think about salvation fundamentally through the image of the face, and that facing one another becomes, and facing God becomes the dominant metaphor amidst all of the many. Not that he wants to eradicate the other ones, but becomes the dominant metaphor for how we think about salvation. And one of the reasons I like that is because it has strong affinities with the idea of the beatific vision, the idea that, coming face to face with God, as Paul describes it in the first letter to the Corinthians, coming face to face with God is the destiny of the human beings that God is drawing back to life and back to God's self. So we are made ultimately, and this is to anticipate the eschatology theme, which is your next one, we're made ultimately to come face to face with God. And part of the way we make that journey is to be better, become better and better at facing one another. And faces appeal to David too, because they're places in which we're both particularized, we're deeply and uniquely ourselves, and yet we don't sort of own our face. In fact, our face is sort of more available to others than it is to us in some ways. And that in that sense, faces are outward-facing and interconnecting things that carry us and stretch us and extend us in multiple directions. So we're both more particularized, we become more ourselves, and we become more related and incorporated with others. David is an extrovert, and I've always thought this is this kind of a theology of the atonement for extroverts, but which I'm not. But it has affinities with von Balthasar's account of salvation as being made, and this has Ignatian roots in the Ignatian exercises, of being made more a person in a bigger drama. So the metaphor of becoming an actor in a drama is one of von Balthasar's dominant metaphors. And in a way, a bit like the face, you become more particularly you, and you become more related to everybody else in this model. But you have to be the person God intends you to be. So part of what salvation is, according to Balthasar, is becoming the real you. And we play so many multiple roles in our lives, which reflect parts of us or aren't really us at all. And there's so much pressure on us to play so many different roles that Balthasar argues that our real and hardest task, in a way, is to find the way to be the person God intends us to be. And when we find that only, as it were, in the drama, in which our true role is prepared for us by God. It becomes something we can inhabit and play out, and we have to do that with other people. So the relational model is a very popular one, I would suggest, in various thinkers in recent decades. Let me leave you with a couple of questions that I think are very sharp ones, and then I'm going to look at one last very contemporary work of art before we open it up to questions and discussion. The first question is, how can one person atone for another person? I think this is a really difficult question for modern people to answer. How can one person atone for another? The reason I think it's a hard question is because we are so individualistic. Because one of the great, and by great I mean most significant, not necessarily great in a good way, but one of the most significant developments of the modern period, post-Enlightenment, is that the idea of sovereignty remains absolute but becomes distributed. So where once we might have, as it were, regarded God alone as sovereign, and us all in some way together subject to that sovereignty, and we might have held to the idea that under God, a monarch, for example, or some kind of religious authority figure was sovereign. Progressively what happens is that sovereignty becomes everyone's own unique possession, themselves. And that's one of the things we're all trying to negotiate, certainly in modern Western societies, and don't easily have answers to all the problems that generates. Because if your sovereignty over yourself is absolute, but everyone else's too, how are you going to negotiate that? Where do the categories and where does the wisdom of interdependence come in? And vulnerability and so on, and hierarchy. Can you have it anymore? And so on. These are all problems that we're working out with quite a lot of pain in contemporary society. But it means that it's actually very difficult to answer the question, how can anyone represent anyone else? And if you can't even represent anyone else, how can you atone for anyone else? if you think of atonement as some kind of representative action. And it's a real problem too for those in the church, in public ministry in the church, because you are a representative figure. And in a culture which is deeply suspicious of representative action, which thinks anything that, as it were, speaks for another is a betrayal or a usurpation of the other, and that speaking not what you personally think, but what the body you represent thinks is hypocrisy. It's incredibly difficult to be a representative figure. I think this is hugely difficult for clergy, it's hugely difficult for politicians, and a range of other people in public life. And it's because we don't understand any longer how you can represent another. So that's something to think about. I don't have a magic answer to that one, but most doctrines of the atonement presume representation is possible. And that leads, I suppose, inevitably to the specifically Christological question: what's so special about Christ that his action can atone for everyone? So it's not just the question of whether one person can represent another, but how it is that Christ can represent everyone. The scandal, so-called scandal of particularity. And that's a very difficult one too for modern people, for a lot of the same reasons, but it becomes, as it were, to the nth degree, because a single figure representing everyone is kind of, if you don't even think one person can represent another, then how are you going to deal with that? And that, I think, too, opens on to some of the difficulties we face as we think about everyone anyway, because that idea of the sort of universal humanity is one that is not so current, really, in a culture that's very much more postmodern, more fragmented, and less comfortable in talking in the language of universals. Well, what is so special about Christ such that his action can atone for everyone? I'm not going to answer it, but it is the question that opens the door to at least two types of answer, which go right back to the two most typical kinds of atonement theory. Some of them more moral, some of them more, you might say, ontological. On the ontological side, one of the theologians, I think, who explores this most interestingly is the medieval theologian Nicholas of Cusa, not somebody often read these days. But he, and this is to go back to the language of folds, Nicholas of Cusa has a whole kind of account of salvation history that works through the metaphor of the fold. And he says that basically all of the creation, all of the universe, all of the created universe is enfolded. The Latin is implicatio, which means enfolded. The whole of creation is enfolded initially in Christ. It unfolds, explicatio, and then having unfolded, it then is sort of re-enfolded into God, complicatio, so folded with us. Okay, so Christ, who, as it were, contains everything in himself, in creation, the origin of creation, unfolds. So the agency of God to create is worked out through Christ, the Logos. Everything is unfolded, and then all of the creaturely bounty and freedom and distinction and particularity that is unfolded from Christ gets complicated, as it were, re-enfolded into the life of God. And that's something Christ can achieve because he is, if you like, ontologically the one in whom everything, all the folds meet, the nexus of creation, the point at which everything intersects. So if you believe creation is one and is actually bound together as one thing, then the step you would then need to take is to say that the binding agent, okay, the key nexus, the point at which all of the lines and all the particularities converge and meet, is Christ. And that is properly a human being, which Nicholas of Cusa argues it is, because not an angel who is bodiless and not an animal who, he argues, is spiritless. That's controversial too these days. But precisely a human, where all of the different parts of creation come together appropriately, the center, in the center. It's anthropocentric, I know, but he's got an ontological account of Christ as the one in whom everything is enfolded. And then there's the moral, the idea that Christ's action atones for everyone, which it might not be just that Christ offers an example that's our only hope if we follow it, but rather that, that Christ is relationally active still. And I think that's a rather interesting one. So the death of Christ is the prelude to a risen life in which Christ is ongoingly active in the world, and that all the things that we know Christ did in his earthly life, walking around from town to town, as the Gospels put it, knocking at people's doors metaphorically, encountering individuals one after another, that in the resurrection life of Christ becomes in principle a limitless series of encounters. Right? Christ never stops, and everyone will be faced. We're back to that facing metaphor. Everyone will be encountered in their particularity, in their place, in their community, because the risen Christ is doing what he did in Galilee, but now as the risen one in the power of the Spirit, still active, still encountering us. And that's what binds, that's what will bind and heal the world. Even if it needs a lot of time, or even a kind of eschatological dollop of time to complete the process. One last set of images, which I think fold some of these things together. The Vatican decided in 2013, I think, initially, to have a pavilion at the Venice Biennale, that huge art fair, indulgent art fair, where different countries have their own pavilion and display art. And the Vatican had never done this, but because it technically is a country in its own right, it thought it would get in on the scene, partly through the imagination of Cardinal Ravasi, who's now retired, but you see him in this photograph, who is very passionate about modern and contemporary art. So they did, and they had one in 2013, and then the second one in 2015. And this is one of the works that was created for the 2015 Vatican Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. Now, all they did was to give their artists a biblical text. In 2013, they gave them the opening chapter of the book of Genesis, so they thought that the natural next thing to do in 2015 was to give them the opening chapter of John's Gospel, both big texts about origins and creation. And the artist, Elpida Hadzi Vasilova, who you can see standing on the left, looking slightly askance at the cardinal and all of the sort of black-clothed clerics, was brought up in communist Macedonia. She didn't know the Bible at all, and so she had to work out what the prologue to John's Gospel meant. And that's where I first met her, because she went looking for theologians to ask her to help to understand this weird text and to give her ideas about the work. So we had quite a few conversations. But what she ended up making is something that I think is a fabulous thing to think with as we think about the doctrine of the atonement. She made a canopy. You can see it there stretching above them, which was beautifully translucent and has almost like a damask silk effect in it. But the material she made it from is the caul fat of pigs, which she cleans painstakingly and dries and then mounts on cellophane into these huge and very beautiful swags that she then suspends over the space. So it becomes this protected, canopied space. And then in the middle of it, she suspended, as you can see, by what look like ropes, a very large central round object. And the ropes are made from the intestines of sheep that she dries and weaves into ropes. And the large round central object, which is just a little bit above adult head height and looks maybe a bit like a hanging pyx or a sacred heart, is made of the stomach of cows, the third stomach of the cow particularly, which it turned out is known by the slaughtermen as the Bible, because the folds of flesh are like big thick pages. So there are all these folds in that central round object suspended in the middle. But it's pierced, as it were, by these ropes, or is it held in place by them? And in a way, it's both. So if you think of it as like the Sacred Heart, or actually, rather wonderfully, the seat of emotion in the Bible is not the heart, that's the seat of intellect. The seat of emotion is the gut. So when Jesus feels emotion, it's in his gut. This is the seat of compassion and the seat of anger, both of which are described as emotions that Jesus feels in his gut. Then, as it were, it's better that this heart-like thing is a gut. This is where Jesus is bound to us. It's from the gut that he's bound to us. It's because of his anger at injustice and sin, and it's because of his love that he binds himself to us. And the ropes that perhaps emerge from that gut, or indeed bind it, pierce it, represent that sense of his gut binding him to us, salvifically, I would argue. And the effect of this tightly folded centre, this unfolded canopy, and this sense of a connected space and a binding space, is to create a space of gathering, because people come in under the canopy and move around. It becomes a place of dwelling, a place of abiding. And so in multiple ways, different metaphors for atonement, for salvation, are gathered in this work and allowed to coexist. You don't have to choose one over the others. What we see is the piercing of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ, becoming a binding to us. We see the outcast, the pig of all things, moving to the center as becoming the overarching canopy, just as those who are cast out are drawn back by Jesus into a new participation. We see the filthy made clean. These are intestines. And we see that which was hidden, because intestines are in the dark, if anything is, being transfigured and brought into the light, all of which are great themes of the prologue of John's Gospel. The inglorious is made glorious, and we have beheld that glory, and we participate in that glory. And above all, the unfolding enfolds, and this place is created in which we can be together, facing one another, in fellowship with one another and with God. So it's, I think, an astonishing bringing together of different atonement models. I've gone on a bit too long, apologies for that, but I'll stop there and we'll have some time for discussion. Thank you for listening.